Good morning, everyone. I'm Carolyn Blackwood from the Board of Directors of IDA, and I want to welcome you to this session, The Link Between Learning Disabilities and Social-Emotional Development. But more importantly, I want to introduce you to Emerson Dickman, who is past chair of IDA. He's been past board member of the National Joint Committee on Learning Disabilities. He was the chair of the Scientific Consensus Meeting sponsored by National Center of Child and Human Development of NIH, resulting in the research definition of dyslexia. I could go on and on. I promised him I wouldn't, but I'd like you to meet my dear friend, Emerson Dickman.
Can you hear me all right? I don't know. I never know whether this works, and I don't like to stand at the podium. All right? So it's interesting. I've got an hour to do this. Hopefully I can get in what I want to get in, but just like you're not Dr. Gross, but Linda Gross. She gave a similar presentation yesterday that I attended. It was excellent. I was very pleased to hear it because issues like this, there are some people like Linda and myself that have been talking about them for years. I'm glad to see, people starting to relate to the concept of executive functioning and social communications, being connected. In this particular case, with an hour, as much as Linda could do or I can do in that time is like fly over. It's like fly over Switzerland, look at the mountaintops instead of walking through it. I wish we could take you through on a walking tour, but we can't. I'm an attorney. I've been advocating for students in special ed for over 40 years. And so a lot of this is based upon my experience. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk to you briefly about, and I mean briefly because that's another hour and a half talk. I'll talk to you about, concept of what is a learning disability. If I asked everybody in here to give me an idea of what they thought a learning disability was, I would guess that you would all have very different, definitions, in spite of the fact many of us here feel that we're experts in the field of learning disabilities, either as a practitioner or as a parent. But there are great differences in what people feel learning disabilities are. But in order to understand what I'm saying, you have to understand what I think a learning disability is. I may not change your mind. We'll talk about the link research, and what I mean by that is the link between learning disabilities and behavior. We'll talk about the goal of education, which is sometimes missed on not teachers, not parents, not students, but it's sometimes missed on administration, and it's sometimes missed at the legislative level. I'll talk about, very briefly, a case study so that we have somebody that is meaningful to talk about. We'll talk about the role of Gestalt and theory of mind, and why do we wait so long to help children in need. The predictable progression of untreated learning disabilities. We know, what's going to happen if we don't provide services to a child with a learning disability. We let it happen anyhow in our particular system of education. There's something we can do about that. We'll talk about that very briefly and say what can be done to help. So first, by the way, I have to look back once in a while, which is not always the case if I have all my slides. But I've hidden so many slides in this particular presentation that I'm not sure what's coming up next. So bear with me. What is a learning disability? I asked, when I was on the National Joint Committee of Learning Disabilities not too long ago, I asked the gentleman sitting next to me who didn't want to be identified, JWL, John Wills Lloyd, by the way. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, and he's really an outstanding person. I said, what is your definition of a learning disability? And basically what he said was a learning disability, after a lot of thought, by the way, is a term we invented to provide services to children in need for additional help. I thought that was a terrific definition for his purpose. The problem with this definition, of course, is who are the children in need? That's what we're trying to find out. So you look on Google and say, what does learning disability mean? Well, the first one that came up, at least when I did it, it might be different today, it says difficulty acquiring knowledge and skills. 2, a neurological condition that interferes with a person's ability to store, process, or produce information. Am I in anybody's way over here? I'm sorry, I'll go over here. Okay. Children who have average to above average intellectual abilities yet are failing. Does anybody really believe that you have to have average to above average intelligence to have a learning disability? I mean, that, we haven't really believed that in 30 years. But nevertheless, it's one of the, leading definitions that you can find on Google. In order to understand what a learning disability is, we have to understand what adaptive functions are. Adaptive functions are the abilities necessary to carry out the activities demanded in the culture in which a person lives. Okay? That's what education is intended to do, is to provide us with the adaptive functions necessary to survive in our culture. Vygotsky said a term disability is not determined by the deficit, but by the social consequences of that deficit. Due to the limitations of PowerPoint, I have here a culture of jockeys. Okay? They have to be small and light in order to be successful at what they do. So if this gentleman is born into that culture, he has a deficit. He has a disability. He can't contribute to that culture. And you get something like this. You see that it just doesn't work. The relationship between education and adaptive functioning is absolutely direct. For instance, early communities, they needed to hunt, fish, and gather in order to survive. So what did we teach children as they were growing up? We taught them to hunt, fish, and gather. Later we taught them to herd, to grow crops, and to barter. And now they need to read, they need to write, they need to figure, they need to socialize. One of the issues, and I won't go into this because we could talk about this all night, but one of the issues is what we teach, is our core curriculum. Is what we teach a bottom-down function or a top-up function? I mean, it's our culture that is supposed to be modifying what is being taught in our schools. It's got to remain relevant to the adaptive functions that the culture is requiring of us. Just like, we went from hunting to learning to read. Is this making sense? Okay, good. Every once in a while somebody says, it's making sense. Okay. Okay, this is another hour and a half or 2 hour talk is on the definition that that has been arrived at with consultation with 25 or 30 researchers and scientists throughout the United States. Same basic people that I used 20 years ago to begin the discussion on the definition of dyslexia that we're all using today. And this is basically what we've come up with. I mean, it's not been published. It hasn't been adopted by the NIH or anybody else, but nevertheless, it seems to make sense to a great number of the scientists that are involved in the field right now. Learning disabilities reflect natural variations in brain function. We're not talking about a disorder or a disease. These are natural variations. For instance, some of us, and we were talking about this last night, GPS has made us all very good at finding things, right? That there were once in our past, if you didn't have a good sense of direction, you were seriously disabled at some point. And you would have been called learning disabled. Now we have GPS, we're no longer learning disabled, but would anybody say that a person that has a bad sense of direction is diseased or disordered in some way? No. Some of us have good, some of us are bad. Some of us are jockeys, some of us are basketball players. Some of us are good athletes, some of us are good musicians. So it's a natural variation in brain function that predicts an unexpected difficulty learning a skill or concept that's valued by the culture. When sense of direction was valued, that was important. Now that it's not valued so much, it's no longer important, in which the individual is expected to perform. Such difficulty is neither correlated with intelligence nor generalized to all areas of learning. Yes, Mr. Green.
Where did that definition come from?
Me.
You did it.
No, I didn't do it, no. For instance, natural variations was contributed by Joe Torgerson, so there was a number of, yes, I took information from different people, put it together, sent it out again, said, is that okay? And they said, that's okay. So, and we went on. And then at some point, about a year ago, it kind of stalled because nobody wanted to take over the responsibility to write an article about it like they did about the IDA definition, etc. So that pretty much capsulizes what I think a learning disability is. Natural variations that predict unexpected difficulties, that are valued, okay? The one thing we also know is that supportive life experience and or appropriate instruction can make learning disabilities less severe. I mean, it's important to recognize that because very often we hear that learning disabilities are lifelong. Dyslexia is lifelong, right? Well, I'm going to have something to say about that in a second. Learning disabilities may coexist with, but are distinct from variation in achievement due to other causes. Every one of those Google definitions couldn't be true for a person that was hit on the head with a hammer. They were not related to learning disabilities. In particular, you could look at each one of those, which I think are in the handout, and figure out for yourself why they don't make a lot of sense. Secondary consequences may include diminished sense of self-efficacy and or social marginalization. Now, that's what I'm going to address in greater detail in a minute. The takeaway from talking about, the concept of learning disability is that the problems are localized or not generalized to all areas of learning. If the problem was generalized to all areas of learning, we'd be talking about a developmental disability or a global intellectual deficit, correct? But if the child is poor at reading and good at math, I'm way oversimplifying, then you have a learning disability. It's interesting that this was 1902. In 2010, research done by the Shawitzes said exactly the same thing. Said for the dyslexic child, okay, the disability was localized and not generalized for the dyslexic child, but not for the neurotypical child, okay? Every human being experiences variations in brain function. Only those variations that impact adaptive functioning are meaningful, and failure is not a prerequisite. Disability can be prevented. I said I was going to get back to that. I don't know, by the way, whether lifelong is one word or two words or should be hyphenated, but nevertheless, dyslexia is lifelong. But with proper intervention, the associated disability need not be lifelong. I mean, we're all dyslexic, but with good intervention, we don't have to be disabled. Okay. This is a quote I love. A synonym is a word you use when you can't spell the word you first thought of. Okay? And that's and how many people remember who Burt Bacharach is? Raise your hand. Okay. The number of people who remember Burt, goes less and less every time I do that. He was a great musician, songwriter, etc. The link research. What does it say about the link between learning disabilities and behavior? Well, in my experience, and this is just my, biased experience based upon, the people that come to see me, about 75% of children that are classified as having emotional, disabilities, emotional disturbance, about 75% of them have, in hindsight, a learning disability profile that would have predicted their emotional problems at the age that I saw them. So let's assume adolescence or early adolescence. 20% are adopted. Now, this is interesting because children who are adopted are also overrepresented within that 75% category of children with learning disabilities. Okay? But children up here, and I use 20%, it could be 10%, it could be 30%, I don't know, but I use this up here to indicate the children that are only adopted, that did not have any previous learning disability profile that might have given us reason to anticipate that they might have problems in the future. The other group, and it's really quite a bit less than this, abused children who are physically hands-on abused. They're a very small number, in my experience again. The research, however, says that among children with learning disabilities, approximately 83% have secondary emotional disorders. The linked literature says children with learning disabilities make up 50% of adolescents under court supervision, 60% of adolescents in treatment for substance abuse, 50% of children with LD have definable psychiatric disorders, and 62% are unemployed within a year after graduation. Now, don't be too depressed. These are terrible figures. But this is the research that said, yes, there is a link. There's also research that says there isn't a link. Okay? So I could give, the opposite argument too, but there's also research that says maybe. So as an advocate, I was having a great deal of difficulty figuring out what to do for these kids because I didn't know what was wrong. I went to the research so that the scientists and researchers could tell me, what I should be doing to help these children, and it wasn't there because some were saying yes, some were saying no, and my first thought was some are good researchers, some are bad researchers, but no, they were all good researchers. They were all good, respected researchers. So what was going on? Well, what was going on was they were looking at different kids. Okay, they were looking at different kids. This is as Werner von Braun said, who people don't remember either, said basic research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, and I kind of like that one. So looking at the research, this was being found by me. Number one, children with learning disabilities, yes, were being apprehended more often. They can't talk their way out of things. Okay? Two, they were being found guilty more often, pretty much for the same reason. And three, they were punished more severely, so they would be under court supervision for a longer period of time. I once knew two brothers. One was really very glib and, outspoken, and the other was quiet and withdrawn. And both of them were stopped on a Halloween night with a little stuff in their pockets that probably shouldn't have been in their pockets. One went home. They were stopped at the same time. They were brothers. One was sent home, and one was brought to the police station. Guess which one was brought to the police station? There is a certain amount of unfairness in the judicial system when it comes to people and children with learning disabilities. There are also environmental influences. School failure is an influence. Children that fail in school are obviously more likely to have social and emotional problems. Correct. Low socioeconomic status, we all know that's the case. And lo and behold, also my experience was reinforced by the research that said adopted child status is also a significant, factor in predicting those kind of problems. So what I did was I went to the research and I started to collect it, and I think it took me about 3 or 4 years. And I looked at literally well over 100, articles and research projects on this topic, and this was back in 1996. And what I found was the subtypes of learning disability vary significantly in severity of risk for the development of antisocial behavior. Different subtypes have different risk. So what was happening, oh, by the way, this I loved because Hollis Scarborough also wrote in Annals of Dyslexia, by the way, and this was, 2003. And I never get quoted in other people's articles, so this was fun for me. Our results are consistent with Dickman's 1996 argument that the risk of psychosocial problems may depend on the type of learning disability involved. So it's not for all kids. So if I looked at the yes, no, maybe, research, what I found was the reading, spelling, or the dyslexic child up here had a very low risk. Because they were good socially. They get along with people. A lot of us hide our disability or just don't care because we're accepted socially, et cetera. Executive function, symptom complex, et cetera. Attention deficit disorder. This was pretty much the no category. The link was there, but it was mild. Okay? This was the maybe category. The link was also there, but sometimes it was an impact and sometimes it wasn't. what I found was anything under this, where this is social communications disorder, anything from here down was the yes category. Does this make sense? So now I could look at the research and I would say, okay, it's all good. It's all good. It's just that the researchers that found no link were looking at, 5, 6, not 5 or 6 year-old, but 5th and 6th grade dyslexic students. And the researchers that were looking at these kids were looking at kids that were already exhibiting serious emotional problems in adolescence, and because their history, I'm having difficulty with this particular one, their history was pretty significant in terms of the kind of learning disability history they had had. So I hope that's making sense, because that's how I explained the research. So now I'm in a better shape to help kids, because I have an idea what's going on. Yes?
The social communication deficits, children with autism fall under that?
I'll get to it. The question is, do children with autism spectrum fall into this category? By the way, when we're talking about autism spectrum, when I started in this business 40 years ago, autistic meant one thing. It means something else today. It means something totally different today. Especially with the DSM-5, coming out with autism spectrum disorder. So it's, I'm afraid that sometime in the future, if you have a toothache, you'll be within the autism spectrum. So it's something that has to be looked at with some, what do they call, granularity. That's it. Okay, so what I found, therefore, in the research, was that 20% of kids, there's something here. Okay, all children, 20% of children. And I'm using purposely inflated numbers. The number of children that are identified as having learning disabilities is probably something less than 20%, right? But we think of 1 in 5, generally speaking. So 20% of children have LD. You know how many children that are identified as LD have reading problems? Fall in the dyslexia category? Anybody? 80%. 80%. So 16%, of children, that 80% of the learning disability group, the research says, doesn't have a significant link between their disability and the development of antisocial behaviors. That leaves what? 4% of the learning disability population that's at risk. And one of the things we know for sure is that when we look at children under court supervision, 50% of children under court supervision have learning disabilities. So what does that tell us? That approximately 4% of children make up 50% of children under court supervision. I mean, now that is a horrifying number. And there's somebody's at fault for this. Now, Reed Lyon and Bob Pasternak, who's going to give the keynote tomorrow, have said that learning disability is recognized as not just an educational problem, but a social and health problem as well. Understanding learning disabilities is a significant public health and safety issue. So we're finished with the link research. What is the goal of education? Unfortunately, very often, we judge the value of education and the goal of education from an academic perspective. But children develop not only academically, but they develop socially, they develop emotionally, and in other ways. So the Congress of the United States has said the overall goal of education is to prepare children to lead productive, independent adult lives. That goes back to what the culture wants from us. The culture wants from us certain skills so that we can be productive, so that we can contribute, so that we can, be independent. And that just surprised me because there's 2 or 3 other slides that usually follow that, but nevertheless. So let's talk about Jared. Knowing the child is more important than knowing the law. I consider myself, by the way, as an advocate, a child advocate, not a parent advocate, because one of the things I realized very early on was that if I didn't believe that I was doing the right thing for the child that I was representing, I wouldn't do a good job. So in my talk to parents when they come in to see me, I make it very clear that if we should diverge in what we feel, and I'm not right, I'm not always right, but if we should diverge in what we feel is in the interest of the child, I will, give you 3 other attorneys or advocates that know what they're doing, because knowing the child and being able to have some idea of what's in the best interest of the child is my goal. Got to see how much time we have. So let's get to know Jared really quickly. Jared is described by his parents as impulsive, oppositional, rigid, stubborn, black and white. There's a lot of this you said yesterday. Same kid, different name. Okay? Gets in your face, won't compromise. It's his way or no way. He has no friends. He could do anything. He's so smart. This is one thing parents say all the time. He could do anything. He's so smart. Why is he having such a problem? He stopped trying. He won't study for tests. He won't do his homework. But he's so smart. How many people recognize children like this? Okay? So most of you do, and even some of you that didn't raise your hand probably do. All right? The school district, now the school district's perspective is biased. We're all biased. For instance, parents are likely, if the child's having a problem, to blame the school. School is likely, if the child's having a problem, to blame the parent. It's just normal. Doesn't mean somebody's good, somebody's bad. It's a bias we should be aware of so that we can communicate effectively. There's a whole bunch of other biases. By the way, another talk, another 2 hours. So we could be here a long time. But their description is the problems are at home. He's unmotivated. He's lazy. He's disruptive. He's a loner. He makes a poor choice of friends. He's probably at this point experimenting with drugs. He's oppositional and defiant. And, he's probably depressed and needs counseling. So mom and dad, you better get on it because things aren't good. Okay? I'm sorry. This is what schools have said. And I've heard them say this. I'm sorry. We just don't see it in school. Whatever's happening at home, it's not affecting his education. And there's really nothing we can do. Is that a fair statement? Even the educators will tell me that's a fair statement. But the educator in a circumstance like this is sticking their head in the sand, whatever. Okay, because what is happening, at least initially, is the child is keeping himself under control in school by taking drugs. But the drugs are natural. It's adrenaline and cortisol is coursing through this child's system all day long while he's in school. And when he comes home and his behavior is no longer a major concern, those drugs flush out of the system and they melt down a lot of time. So there's a good reason why they're being good in school and melting down at home. This is one of my favorite quotes too, especially when I'm writing something. Copy from 1, it's plagiarism. Copy from 2, it's research. I like that. So the role of Gestalt and theory of mind. Okay? In order to be able to help these children, you have to discover the cause. What's happening? What is the problem? Reedline said if you don't know the cause, you get treatment or instructional paradigms built on faulty assumptions. Now think about, for instance, dyslexia. How many people think that dyslexia is a visual problem? But if you've been here for 20 minutes, it's how we process sound versus how we process what we're seeing. Jean Charles said, the blind are better readers than the deaf. Okay? Because reading is closer to hearing than it is to seeing. Okay? So that if we still thought it was seeing, we'd be doing the wrong thing. That's the point I'm making here. This is something I call Algernon Syndrome. Okay, this is something we can talk about at some point. Algernon Syndrome involves over-reliance on process for task completion. Okay, and where I got it, are you familiar with the book Flowers for Algernon? Okay, a lot of you are. And there was a movie a long time ago called Charlie that got all kinds of Academy Awards. In the book, but not in the movie, there's a scene where Charlie, who's a person who is very cognitively impaired, takes a pill, gets smart, and then the pill wears off and he gets cognitively impaired again. Sometime during that roller coaster there, he's on an assembly line in a bakery, and he's being asked to make buns. And so he's being asked to pat it, this way, take it, and put it on a conveyor belt, brings it into the oven. Does anybody remember that? No. I read the book 30 years ago, so I might have it a little bit off. So the guy to the right of him was trying to help him, learn how to do this. So you pat it, it goes into the oven, no problem. He was still having problems doing it. So the guy on the left was helping him do it. Put him like this, going in the oven. All right, so he still was having problems. And the reason he was having problems was because the guy at the right was doing it with his elbows at his side. And the guy on the left was doing it with his elbows up in the air. And to him, he couldn't distinguish the relevant from the irrelevant in completing that particular task. He was totally process-oriented because he didn't have the gestalt. He wasn't able to get the big picture. He didn't see where it was going. What are we trying to accomplish? He knew the task had to be completed by following a series of steps that would, eventually be successful. The inability to reason critically and see the big picture, the forest for the trees, and the relationship of the steps necessary to achieve the goal. That's, the problem. Recently, I heard somebody say, I don't know, it was on the radio or something, don't forget, I don't know who it was, said that the definition of genius is being able to get from A to D without going through B and C. Now, I don't know if that's truly the definition of genius, but it certainly makes life easier for us, doesn't it? If we can see alternate ways to achieve a particular goal. If all we can see to achieve the task is the process necessary to complete the task, then we are dependent on that process. And these children are often looked upon as perfectionistic and having OCD traits and characteristics. They even sometimes get the diagnosis. Okay, but are they really OCD? These are children that have executive function and organization problems, and they're perfectionistic. Boy, that's a dissonance, isn't it? That's a dissonance. Okay, so Algernon Syndrome. This is in, I think, a couple of places in your stuff. Oh, by the way, one of the handouts says draft on it. That's because I wrote it last night. No, I didn't write it last night. I didn't write it last night, but I did write it, very recently, and it probably needs a lot of editing and stuff like that. But I thought since I was coming down here and talking to you, it might be something you would be interested in because it kind of takes this talk and expands on it a little bit. So critical thinking is the ability to reason by analyzing evidence provided in your environment. You're looking at the clues and you're forming conclusions based upon those clues constantly. Now, critical thinking is necessary for theory of mind. Theory of mind is what Linda was talking about yesterday, too. It's what is somebody else thinking about what I'm doing? Okay, what are they going to think? If I, stand on my head in the middle of the classroom, am I going to be a hero or am I going to be seen as a jerk? Theory of mind is something that, like reading, is not natural. It can be taught. Okay, and some kids can learn it very easily, just like some kids learn how to read very easily. You give them print, they automatically see that, hey, this print lines up to spoken words, etc. But with theory of mind, same thing. Most kids get it without too much effort. Some kids need to be taught. Do we teach theory of mind? Not necessarily. Not until it's almost too late. But theory of mind problems impact, perspective taking ability and verbal discourse, social communications in general, and paralinguistics and pragmatic language. Social communications problems, impact social competence. Critical thinking problems also impact your ability to achieve a gestalt, a big picture of what's going on. Are there alternate ways to achieve the goal? I have, etc. They're very much connected, theory of mind and gestalt, because they both require that you look at the clues in your environment, whether they're nonverbal clues, facial expression, body language, that kind of thing, or whether they're actual, clues, and put them together and arrive at a conclusion on your own. So it gives you the ability to have Gestalt gives you ability to conceptualize the big picture. If you can conceptualize, you can organize and plan. If you can't, you have difficulty with predicting, organizing, planning, initiating, prioritizing, sequencing. Where should I start? What should I, what's a, main idea, supporting detail, etc. I'm going faster than I would like, but nevertheless. Now, these problems, eventually impact math and expressive writing abilities, because expressive writing requires organization, and math at a certain level requires analytical skills. So sometimes these children can be seen as good readers, and they have good memories, so they're relatively good at math up until about the middle of the third grade, when things start to get difficult for them because they need those analytical thinking skills for math, and they need inferential thinking skills for reading comprehension. Because they can decode, they just have difficulty with comprehension. But here we'll get into that. They have difficulty generalizing information. My room number here has 5 digits. Who here thinks I'm going to remember what that room number is next week? Okay? And one of the reasons I'm not going to bother remembering it, because next week it has no meaning for me. It's got no real world context. I remember what it is while I'm here because it's got meaning. A lot of these children have difficulty relating learned information to a real world context. And therefore, they can get A on a test and next week be given the same test and not get the right answers because they haven't made a link between learned information and its value in the real world, its use. It's not a tool that they see that has value. And so they have difficulty retaining information over time. They have difficulty predicting and anticipating, and as a result, self-monitoring and self-regulation. So that, you can't predict if you can't see the big picture, right? Does anybody know what orienteering is? Yeah, some people do. For those of you who don't, raise your hand real quick. So I know it's a lot. Okay, there's a number of people that don't. Very quickly, you're given a distance and a direction on a compass. And in order to get to the goal, you've got to follow the right direction and you've got to take the right distance to the next stop, and then they give you another distance and another, compass heading, and you go like that. And that's the only way you can achieve the goal of the task, is to follow that direction. Well, and you can't predict where you're going to be. You can't anticipate where you're going to end up. You have no idea until you get to the end. So kids that have difficulty predicting and anticipating, that are process dependent, have difficulty with self-monitoring and self-regulation, which causes hypervigilance because they don't know what's going to happen next. If you don't know what's going to happen next, you're afraid of what's going to happen next because it's unknown. Okay? And they become anxious, which of course leads to problems with social competence again. All right? So now we're talking also about kids that take language very literally. Okay? They've got good vocabularies. But if their best friend calls them a jerk, has a smile on his face and pats him on the back, he thinks his best friend now thinks he's a jerk, and he's going to respond based upon that fact. And because he's taking the language literally and he's not including those nonverbal cues, context, facial expression, tone of voice, body language, all that stuff, not taking that into consideration. And in spoken language, some people will say that 80% of spoken language, for the purpose of determining intent, is nonverbal. Okay, so when you take language literally, you're losing a lot. And that affects comprehension both orally and affects, it's all in your handouts. You don't have to take a picture of that, although I appreciate you taking a picture. Okay, and if you have problems with comprehension, you take language literally, you've got difficulty with social competence. One of the reasons why I put this together is because in the field of executive functioning, which I think is wonderful, we have lists of, things that are impacted by executive functioning. And nobody that I can see, has developed a meaningful taxonomy so we know where to start and where to end. So what happens is we end up having a child that has a serious emotional problem and that is involving, again, I just surprised myself, apologize. Academic problems include, comprehension, expository writing. It's because it has to be done in an organized fashion, and higher level math, social skills, literal, pragmatic communication, weaknesses, self-regulation, emotional problems, cognitive dissonance, which is something I'll talk about in a second, external locus of control. You don't feel that you have control over your environment. Everything is happening to you as a surprise. I got to move. And physiological because of the adrenaline and cortisol, going through your system all the time. These kids are perfect targets. Other children neglect them, reject them, abuse them, exploit them, isolate them. And one of the problems is often bullying consists of what? A wink or a sigh. It doesn't need to be a punch in the mouth. All it has to be is you're walking down a hall and somebody goes, and that's a punch in the mouth. And what happens? They react like oxygen in the presence of a spark. So these are kids that, the wink or the sigh is not going to attract the, principal or the vice principal. But, going up to that kid that just did that and punching them in the mouth is going to do it. So the principal comes into the situation. This child who is overreacting, in the principal's mind is being brought, to the principal's office, being punished. And he's twice a victim in his own head. He's not learning anything by that discipline because as far as he's concerned, the other kid started it and he's being punished for it. And there's no recognition of what happened to him. He doesn't have friends because he doesn't speak their language. He does things he shouldn't do because he hasn't learned from past experience. He isn't trying to succeed in order to resolve the psychological pain of cognitive dissonance, which is very important, but I'll do it very briefly. He's rigid and oppositional because of a lack of theory of mind interferes with his ability to negotiate and compromise. If you're a good salesman, the first thing you do is you try to figure out what the other guy wants from you, so that you can get him to take what you want him. I think I said that backwards, but nevertheless, you know what I mean. You have to, in order to compromise and negotiate, you've got to know what the other guy wants so that you can make the trade. Kids without theory of mind, they can't compromise because they don't know what the other person is thinking. So why do we wait so long to help children in need? Why do we wait to help? Well, this is supposed to be a bridge, the under part of a bridge. What do we do with bridges? We inspect them. Why? To avoid a catastrophe, to avoid the bridge collapsing. I'm going back on a plane tomorrow morning. I'm glad that they inspect those engines before we take off because I don't want to crash. But as far as our children are concerned, it's our children that we allow to collapse and crash. Because until they collapse or crash, there's no mechanism in our educational system to bring services to their attention. We've been using the term interventionist. Have you noticed that a lot during the conference? I think that's great because interventionist means we're going to get to them before their problems, become too big to be able to deal with effectively. So what a learning disability isn't, and I could do this, I've got 3 slides that follow this with other quotes. Discrepancy formulas, even if they're not in the law, are in our heads because we've had them for so long. If a child is not failing, we don't see a need to help them, in spite of the fact that there are issues that might predict their eventual failure. Nancy Mather, who's spoken several times here and is one of the authors of the Woodcock Psychoeducational Battery, which is the achievement side of this formula, said 25 years ago it requires a student to cross a threshold of failure. Jack Fletcher said the only thing it prevents is prevention. And Tom Hare, who said this at the Library of Congress and he was the head of OSEP under the Clinton administration, said it was immoral. The next page has quotes from Bob Pasternak and a dozen other people, but I made the point. The aptitude achievement approach to determining who's eligible for services is an abomination. The predictable progression of untreated learning disabilities is so obvious that it should be, recognized by everybody, but sometimes you go to school districts and child study teams, whatever they're called in your state, don't recognize a need until there is, some kind of a meltdown. You start off stage 1 with the learning disability. Stage 2 is learning disability plus failure. That's what happens. Stage 3 is failure minus effort and motivation. Okay, do we know kids like this? I like heads bobbing, yes. And then we add anxiety and depression. And Judy Birch, who has also, written a wonderful book, I wish she would stop doing the upgrades to the book, because the ones I have before have all underlined and tagged, and anyway, has said that each stage is exponentially more difficult to address. And so it's an expense item for our school districts to wait until somewhere around here to help these kids. They were so much cheaper to deal with up here. A dyslexic is so much easier to deal with in kindergarten or early first grade than it is to deal with them in the third grade and the fourth grade. And that's just the dyslexic. The kid with the executive function and social communications problem, he's obvious in kindergarten. He's obvious in preschool. We don't do anything to help them usually until about the 8th grade, these kids. Okay, cognitive dissonance is the turning point. What is cognitive dissonance? It is an uncomfortable psychological state in which an individual experiences two incompatible beliefs. Probably the primary example of that is that when bad things happen to good people and you begin to question whether or not there is a kind God out there. So not only are you dealing with grief, but you're dealing with your own beliefs, in that situation. In this situation I'm talking about is, am I smart or am I not smart? Am I smart or am I stupid? These are two different beliefs that a person with a learning disability has to very often deal with. Such an individual is motivated by the attendant discomfort of the psychological pain that exists as a result of dissonance to act in a manner to reduce dissonance. And how do we reduce dissonance? Okay. This is the message we give to children with learning disability all the time, because we know they're so smart. And I'm talking relatively. They don't have to be average or above average to have a learning disability. But they appear to be smarter than their particular ability to perform, is showing. So this is the message we give them, right? So what is the message that they're getting? If I don't try, I can stay smart. That's basically it. If I don't study for a test, and I fail the test, I didn't fail because I was not smart. I failed because I didn't study. A friend of mine who's a neuropsychologist once said, such kids would rather be seen as unwilling than unable. And the thing is that it's not on purpose. It's not done knowingly. It's a psychological defense mechanism to cognitive dissonance. If you read the research, it's very clear that this is what happens. And then the kids lose, they're looked upon as lazy and unmotivated, and when in reality they're just responding to the fact that they have to resolve these two incompatible beliefs. And which would you rather be? Would you rather be not smart, or would you rather be smart? The way I can stay smart is not look not smart. Okay, made that point. Treatment priorities also. One of the reasons I made that chart was to say, okay, what's going on? What should we look at? Because one of the things I don't know what you do in your state, sometimes functional behavior assessments stop at anxiety. The child is anxious, and therefore we have to. But why are they anxious? This guy named Toyota, who started the Toyota motor company, I think he died at 101 or something like that. But one of the things that he did very early on in his career was say, hey, if there's a problem, you've got to ask why 5 times. You can't stop asking why. All right? So if a child is depressed, we don't say, okay, we've got to give him medication for depression. What we should be saying, and I'm not saying medication is bad, by the way, but what we should be saying is, why is he depressed? Oh, he's anxious. Well, why is he anxious? Because he's hypervigilant. He doesn't know what's going to happen next. So the status quo is always superior to the change in his life. Okay. And why is he hypervigilant? Because he's got a locus of control. It's also called learned helplessness. He doesn't feel he's in control of the future of his own life. He doesn't feel he's in control of tomorrow. And why does he have a problem with locus of control? Because he hasn't tried to make things happen, and so long he doesn't know he can make things happen, because his motivation, his effort has been diminished by the cognitive dissonance. And you have the dissonance here, and then why is there a dissonance? Because there's experienced failure. And why is there experienced failure? Because nobody treated the learning disability. I mean, this is not rocket science. But when we diagnose a child like this, we try to deal, we might even say, okay, it's a learning disability, we'll fix the learning disability, and the rest of the stuff will go away. Doesn't work that way. Just like I said here, when you're in a hole, you have to work your way to the surface from the bottom. You have to dig your way up. So that's why it's exponentially more difficult to deal with these kids when they're down here than when they're up here. Okay. So, what can be done to help? I'll try to do this. I got 5 minutes. Gabrielli said, on the average, the longer you wait, the harder it is to help children while doing huge harm to their social and emotional disabilities. And he was talking about learning disabilities, kids with learning disabilities. Frederick Douglass, who was not talking about kids with learning disabilities, said generally, and this is one of my favorite quotes. It's on bus stops all over the nation. It's great. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Unfortunately, a lot of our LD children are broken by the system. So, treatment, what do? I think empowerment is important. We have to make these kids feel that they're in control. Give them choices at home and at school. Of course, choices among appropriate alternatives. You don't just say, where would you like to go to eat, unless you want to end up at a Subway or a Pizza Hut. You say, do you want Chinese? Do you want, Italian? Or do you want, but give them the choices. Give them the opportunity to feel that they're in charge. Develop independent skills. Teaching a child in New York City to ride a horse makes him the best horseback rider in school. Teaching a kid in Florida to ski makes him the best skier, in Miami, right? So he's got status in his community. Islands of competence. Does anybody know Robert Brooks? Robert Brooks is a psychologist in Boston area. Islands of competence. Find out something that they're good at, something that they're interested in. Help them write a book. Put it in the library. Have that child, just like the young man who won the award. Have them go to other, classes and give them a lecture on that particular issue. Help them understand what their disability is or what their problems are. Theory of mind, speech and language. Those are the people that can deal with the theory of mind issues. This lady is a speech and language person. They can address perspective taking, inferential thinking, etc. In New Jersey, generally, speech and language therapists are considered, only qualified to do articulation problems, not communications problems, not language problems, unfortunately. Articulate problem solving and decision making. I tell parents, I say, okay, you have to make a decision about going shopping tonight or tomorrow morning, okay? And you do it all in your own head. If you've got a child like this, don't do it in your head. Do it out loud. What are the pros and cons of going to shopping tonight as compared to going shopping tomorrow morning? And I'm going to make a decision based upon that, thought process. The other thing is I tell dads, when you're driving with your son or your daughter with these problems and you see something that's going on, talk about how come you come to the conclusion that pile of bricks in your neighbor's driveway is going to be whatever it's going to be. Because your child probably hasn't gone through that process. They haven't put the clues together. They haven't formed a conclusion. So let them know that there's meaning to the different things in their environment, that they can use to reason a conclusion. Active listening, that's much more difficult than it appears, but a kid that comes home and melts down and swears and is sent to his room, you haven't accomplished anything. But if you say to a kid that comes home, slams the door and swears or something like that, you say, you sound angry, or something like that. And then their response, allows you to recognize that it was frustration that triggered that anger. Well, that must have made you feel frustrated. And you peel away the onion. And then once you peel away the onion, you send them to their room. The TV with the sound off, that's a fun thing to do. A lot of kids with nonverbal communications problems, you'd be amazed how much more you see on the screen when you turn the sound off. Even for somebody that doesn't have those problems, you see what's going on in the background. You see, emotions emerging through. So make a game out of, making a list of the emotions you see while you're watching a soap opera with the sound off. Metacognition. Keep a diary. Graphic organizers need to be taught to automaticity. They can't just be introduced. They need to be taught to automaticity. Comprehension strategies, Isabel Beck, McKeon's, questioning the author kind of thing. Well, I don't understand what's going on here. What do I think the author intended me to understand? Counseling, dialectical behavioral therapy. You don't want counseling that's going to talk about why I have problems with my mother, etc. You want counseling that talks about the child. How do I think about myself? What do I think about myself? How can change how I think about myself? The team approach is very important. Everybody's got to be on the same page. You've got to work with the school district and your therapists, etc., and everybody's got to be working to reinforce those skills that you are focusing on. One of the reasons I did that chart I went through earlier was because you've got to decide. You've got to make priorities. You can't do everything at once. All of those executive function things that are, 50 or 60 of them, you can't say, okay, we're going to deal with executive functioning. You've got to say, okay, the problem basically is a gestalt. And if we get, I made that point, I think. Okay. Children who feel empowered, and I can do this in a couple of minutes. You don't mind it be a couple of minutes? Children who feel empowered wear their self-confidence like a suit of armor that attracts others to them because of its beauty and shields them from harm because of its strength. Okay, this is my Superman analogy. Here you have, obviously, Superman and Clark Kent. What do we know about them? They're the same guy. Okay? Superman doesn't need to ask for friends. He doesn't need to look for friends. He's standing like this. Or something like this. I don't know that I can do it. And he's saying, I don't give a shit. Whereas Clark Kent, his feet are together, and he's a little bit humped over, and he's looking down more than he's looking up, and he's begging for friends. He wants to be appreciated, etc. And what is the difference? The difference is their posture. Their posture is letting people know how they feel about themselves. Okay? And what their self-confidence is like. When they're self-confident, they don't have to look for friends if you have good self-confidence. Now, let's go back to Jared. Is Jared, he was our example. Is Jared a conduct disordered, oppositional defiant child? Or is he a child with an undiagnosed and untreated learning disability? I think the latter. I hope when you leave, you think that way as well. Now, this is going to be very quick. When I have the time, I would ask the audience, what are the 3 most important things that you learned when you were in high school? And I probably shouldn't have told you the answer. And anyway, and what what the audiences say, inevitably, by the way, not driving, not typing, but nevertheless, social skills. They said nonverbal communications, making and keeping friends, empathy, perspective taking, and metacognitive skills, setting goals, planning, initiating, organizing, time management. And then I asked the audience, how many of these things are you taught directly and explicitly in school? None of them. These are the most important things that teachers have told me they learned while they were in high school. Okay? We have got to put more emphasis on these things. I also asked at an in-service once 110 teachers, special ed and general ed teachers, what makes a successful person? They said happy, self-confident, cooperative, motivated, organized, popular, creative, resourceful, self-directed, caring, good self-image, not afraid to accept a challenge, competitive. Okay? What was interesting about this list, and I didn't take anything off, by the way. I combined some things that were the same, but I didn't take anything off. What's not on this list? These were teachers. Nobody said gets good grades. Nobody said smart. By the way, I was doing this with a psychologist, and that was exactly what we wanted to happen, and it happened. Nobody said smart. There's not a trait here that could not be exhibited by a person with a 50 IQ or could be failed to be exhibited by 150 IQ. What was that? Some people heard what I said under my breath, but nevertheless. Okay. This is Nikki. He's happy. This is Izzy. She's self-confident because she thought that was a pretty outfit. Okay. Izzy is now she's my oldest grandchild, and she's in her second year at Berkeley. Wow. And she dresses better. Okay. Mac, her younger brother, is not afraid to accept a challenge. The keys to success, as far as I'm concerned, are initiative, persistence, resilience. If we can get children to start a project and give them the persistence to continue until the project is completed, and the resilience to try again in inevitable failure. I read a sign the other day as if you're afraid of making a mistake, or if you don't make mistakes, you don't make anything. Okay? That was a good quote. If you don't make mistakes, you don't make anything. And it's true. So you have to have resilience when you make a mistake or have a problem. And being a mathematician, I add these up and they come to passion. If we can give our children and our students passion, they can overcome anything. The takeaway quick is learning disability is a natural variation of brain functions. Subtypes of LD vary significantly in the severity of risk for the development of antisocial behavior. The goal of education is to prepare all children, to lead productive, independent lives. Over-reliance on process as a result of weakness in Gestalt and theory of mind result in academic, social, emotional, and psychological and physiological problems. Discrepancy formulas are an abomination. We can agree on that, I think. The progression of untreated learning disabilities is predictable, and empowerment is the key. Education is not the filling of a pail. This is a very well-known quote. But the lighting of a fire, that's Yeats. And this is a little less known quote, which is Mark Twain. I never let school interfere with my education. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.